Democratic Party gubernatorial candidate Kathleen Sebelius is the guest on Election 02 tonight at 9:30 on KTWU Channel 11.
We are great television and more. Serving viewers in Kansas and Missouri, this is KTWU Channel 11 Topeka and K30AL Channel 30 Iola, Fort Scott, Chanute.
This is Election 02, the governor's race. Tonight's guest is Democratic candidate Kathleen Sebelius, and from the Washburn University Political Science Department, your hosts Bob Beatty and Mark Peterson.
Greetings and welcome to Election 2002, a series of special programs brought to you by KTWU. The purpose of these programs is to provide you, the viewer, with what we hope is a broader and deeper understanding of the positions of the candidates for the major offices on the ballot this November 5th. Today's program features State Insurance Commissioner Kathleen Sebelius, Democratic candidate for governor. I'm Bob Beatty, your co-host, and I'm joined by Mark Peterson. We are both faculty members of the Political Science Department of Washburn University. Welcome. It's nice to have you here.
Thanks. Nice to be here.
Before we get started with our discussion, we want to take a quick look at something you've probably seen a few times, which is one of your campaign ads.
Okay.
Over the years, she's earned our trust, saying no to special interests, putting the people of Kansas first, respecting our tax dollars.
As insurance commissioner, department spending has been reduced 19%. As governor, I'll cut the waste with a top-to-bottom audit of state government.
Kathleen Sebelius, tough performance audits to streamline government and control spending, discipline, commitment, trust. Kathleen Sebelius, governor.
Now, your ad talks about some of the reasons you'd be qualified for the office, and we'll certainly talk about those today. But I'd like to start with the question of why do you want to be governor of Kansas?
Well, I want to be governor because I really care about this state. I think Kansas is the state Gary and I chose to live and raise our boys and work almost 30 years ago. We've never had any doubt about this is a place that we wanted to be, and I think that there are incredible possibilities for Kansas as a cutting-edge 21st century state. I also think we have some challenges and some difficult decisions to make, and I've had some background and experience that I think equip me well to deal with those kinds of challenges.
Can you talk a little bit about your qualifications that are mentioned in the ad?
Well, I served in the legislature for 8 years from a district right here in Topeka, and so I'm familiar with the legislative process, how you get a bill passed, how you put a coalition together and move things ahead. And then in the last 8 years, have really had a chance to take over a failing agency. When I was elected insurance commissioner, it was an office that hadn't been looked at in a long time. In fact, in the 50 years before I was elected, there were only 3 commissioners. So it was a gateway to, at that point, $6 billion industry, but didn't operate very well for the consumers of this state. They were sort of an afterthought, and frankly, didn't serve the companies very well. Things were slow and cumbersome and inefficient. And that experience of really turning around an agency, of delivering on consumer services, putting things in place, streamlining the operations, cutting out waste. The market's grown by about 40%. We have 200 new companies doing business. And at the same time, our operating costs are down by 19%. That combination of experiences, how you make an agency work again for the people, how you cut off the ties with special interests. I didn't take any money from the companies regulated by our office, and that was a first. I think is, again, good combination of experience to then prepare me to look at taking that same mindset across state government.
You've got sort of a hill to climb here if you succeed in this campaign. There have been Democratic governors in recent Kansas history, but it looks like you're going to be confronted with a Republican majority in both the House and the Senate if you win. Given the financial straits that the state finds itself in, sort of leaves an objective outside observer asking, why would you want this pain? How do you plan to deal with this legislature, and do you really consider that you've got a chance to be anything more than a caretaker governor?
Well, I think that whoever is elected governor on November 5th has a huge challenge. How to make the legislature work again, how to put together a working coalition to get things done, and how to confront the budget challenges that we have. And frankly, the numbers change on a regular basis. First, I have a lot of experience putting together that kind of working coalition during most of my public service years as a legislator. All 8 years as insurance commissioner, I've been in the minority party. I have worked with Republican majorities in the House and Senate, and for the last 8 years with also a Republican governor. I think it's really about putting together coalitions, about finding people who share values and visions, and not about partisan party lines, which have become too dominant in the legislative session. About 70% of the legislation that I've taken across the street in the last 8 years has been passed. And that isn't because just the Democrats voted for it, because there are not enough Democrats in either house to pass anything. So I think that experience will be very helpful. In terms of the challenges of how you move ahead in the state, I've really been talking since the campaign began about a top-to-bottom performance audit that has to start on the 6th of November. We're looking at models used by a number of other states. Texas and Illinois and Florida are ones that are particularly interesting. But Texas we keep coming back to because they have had probably the longest experience and the most success at this point. I think it's been a 6-year period of time. Texas has saved about $8 billion with the recommendation that they've taken to the legislature. And it's really a process that involves teams of individuals, some within government and some outside, private business owners and outside experts who meet and look very creatively at what is being done agency by agency, what sort of efficiencies there are, what kind of waste can be eliminated, redundancies, ways to do business differently. And those resources are then refocused on some of the strategic priorities. That's what we need to do in Kansas. It's been almost 20 years since a kind of thorough review of the way we do business in state government has been set up. I did it in the insurance department. I know it can be effective to turn around an operation and deliver more services to more people at a lower cost.
Do you think that sort of thing can actually be accomplished in a time frame that's going to be able to address what are obviously going to be very serious financial constraints in the remainder of this fiscal year and the start of the next one next July?
Well, the new governor, by law, has to present to the legislature a budget within existing resources. That's the law. You have to go through an exercise of looking at what's coming in the door, what services cost, and format it in a way that you make a legislative proposal. That very exercise, I think, is a catalyst to undertake the process that I'm talking about. Will it all be accomplished in the first year? No, in time for the first session. But I do think we can make some strategic priority decisions in those first couple of months that will help frame a first-year legislative budget and then have the process continue on for years. You know, the numbers that we're dealing with are changing on a rapid basis. The July revenue estimate was off by more dollars than any revenue estimate ever in the history of the state. So frankly, we're looking right now at a moving target, both in terms of revenues that may be coming in and also in terms of expenditures. And I think having a process in mind and in place, being ready to go to work, having the people who are willing to be involved in that process identified is really the best way to approach this situation.
Both you and your opponents talk about making government more efficient, looking at programs that can be done better. And a number of people say if this is such a good idea, I mean, a lot of people agree on it, why wasn't this done 4 years ago? As you said, it hasn't been done in 20 years. Why not last year? Why not the year before? It seems like fairly common sense if you're saying this can be a successful thing to do.
Well, I think there is a tendency when budget times are good to not rock the boat. If you have plenty of money coming in the door, if you have resources to give tax cuts and start new programs at the same time, there isn't a lot of incentive to spend a lot of time and energy rethinking the way you're doing business. People are pretty happy. You know, the interest groups who tend to surround the legislature all get a piece of the pie and are pretty satisfied. Unfortunately, even during the best of budget times, which we had in the late 80s and early 90s, we did not fund some important priorities. Public education has not been adequately funded in this state since the formula was passed in 1992. And it leaves us now in a situation where we are significantly below the targeted level identified by outside consultants who were brought in by the legislature. We probably should have accelerated funding for some of the higher education program initiatives that were on the table. So unfortunately, we've got some catch-up to play, but I think having difficult budget times creates some opportunities to really rethink the way we're doing business. The status quo is not okay. We can't assume that we just start with the way we've always run agencies, the way we've always managed government, and just move forward from there, which is the tendency, I think, when things are good.
Well, let me play devil's advocate on that for just a moment. We've got a $4.4 billion budget in the general fund.
Right.
$9 billion worth of spending overall.
Right.
Big chunks of state activity that are not part of the general fund, like highways and transportation. But of that general fund budget, 69 cents of every dollar is already going to education. It's going to the State Department of Education, it's going to higher ed, it's going to all those classifications. It seems to me that that's a fat, juicy target for people on the outside to say, what do you mean it's underfunded? It's getting better than 2/3 of the money that taxpayers pay in expectation of what we normally consider to be government services.
Sure. Well, I think that there's no question that the education systems, whether they be the region schools or community colleges or K through 12 education, needs to be part of the review process. We need to have the same kind of internal look at, are we running 21st century schools? Are the costs minimized at the administrative level and focused on the classroom? Are we paying teachers at an adequate level? Those are fundamental questions that I think school boards and parents and boards of regents have to go through as part of this exercise. But frankly, education over and over again is proven to be not only the ticket to the future for our children and making sure that we can prosper and grow in the 21st century, it's probably the single best economic development engine we have in this state. Having trained workers, having students ready for 21st century jobs is the fastest way we can grow existing businesses and attract new businesses. If we lose quality education, the rest of the economy goes south with it. So we don't have the luxury of even debating whether or not education should be a priority. It has to be a priority if we're going to grow the Kansas economy, keep the good jobs and businesses here, and be able to attract an additional workforce.
Given that there is a statutory state board of education, how much influence can the governor legitimately hope to exercise over that whole process, changing those priorities and redirecting those resources?
Well, I think it has to be a collaboration. A lot of the control of schools really is at the local level, where elected school board members work within the framework of the budgets that they're given to make decisions about classroom sizes and teacher pay. I think the state can do its role by making sure that the dollars are available in every community in the state to fund adequate education. I was looking at something the other day, and it still is mind-boggling to me that in Kansas we have this wide a variance. But in the past, prior to the funding formula, there was an enormous reliance on property tax at the local level to fund schools. And there is some suggestion by my opponent that we go back to that system, allow the local governments to provide for their own students. Well, the problem with that theory is that we have a district in Galena in southeast Kansas where 1 mil of property tax raises $11,000. You have Burlington, Kansas, Wolf Creek area, where 1 mil of property tax raises $480,000. Now, there's a huge difference in what 20 mills added to your local school budget, 30 mills would provide for children in those areas. I'm a believer that the children of Kansas shouldn't be penalized or advantaged necessarily by where they happen to be born. We have a state responsibility to provide suitable education, according to the Constitution, for every Kansas child, and that's really a responsibility that we need to live up to.
Well, let me ask a definition of suitable. As I've talked about before, when I went to school, I played sports, was in the band, did a number of things, and there's a trend, not only in Kansas, but other states, if students want to do those things, music as well, they have to pay for them now. Is this a positive trend for education?
Well, interestingly enough, I don't think suitable was ever really very carefully defined. That's recently been done. The legislature put some criteria out to say this is what suitable education should mean in the 21st century. The consultants who were hired, Augenblick and Myers, who are well-known educational consultants around the country, further defined it. So we now have kind of a working definition of if you're going to have a child in school in 2002, what should your expectations be that that child has available? And it includes fine arts and music and sports and doesn't set up a pay-to-play criteria, which in some areas of the state may be acceptable and not provide a barrier, but in lots of areas of the state really provide a barrier for those children to have access to a broad range of activities. So I think we need to be very careful as we look for ways to save education dollars that we not prohibit all children from having access to suitable education, as broad as that definition is.
Do you have specific goals in your education plan, for example, to increase teacher salaries or things of that nature?
Well, again, the teacher salary decision often is a community-by-community decision. What I know to be a fact is that we are not doing a particularly good job. We are now 41st in the country in what we pay teachers as a state, below the national average. And states around us all pay teachers at a higher rate than Kansas does. So we have a dual problem. We've got a group of teachers in their 50s looking at retiring, and 2,000 less students this year than 5 years ago looking at teaching as a profession, and yet when they come out of school, they can cross the border in almost any direction and be more adequately compensated. That's a huge problem. We need to raise base pay for teachers in every community in the state and do it as rapidly as possible with the new dollars.
Let me take a slight turn in direction here that relates to the point that you
and your
just...
teachers, you all should like that a lot.
We've never come out for or against any.
I know, I know.
We work together. You mentioned the fact that there are 2,000 fewer students pursuing education degrees, and in fact, one of the problems it seems to me that Kansas confronts is that if you look at the 1990 census and you look at the 2000 census, Kansas has not grown by the averages of the nation as a whole. We have a huge metropolitan area on our east side, and we have many small communities in West Kansas that are literally disappearing as families age, move away, and the towns are left essentially with old folks who are there because they've lived there all their lives and are just waiting it out. What do you see as your responsibility as a governor to do something about the demographic trends of Kansas and its sort of long-term prospects for growth and development?
Well, I think it's critical that we see this state as one state and not eastern Kansas and western Kansas, and too much of that goes on in the legislature right now, depending on where you're physically located, your interests are aligned, and I think that's a real problem. Former Governor Bennett talked about when he received the Kansan of the Year award a couple of years ago that probably was the most serious challenge facing the state, that we were becoming two states. And he saw that as a very dangerous prospect in the future. So I think the governor has a huge responsibility looking out for all the communities in Kansas. My husband grew up in northwest Kansas. The Sebelius family was in the Norton and Almena area for generations, as was my mother-in-law. They farmed the land that was homesteaded a couple of generations ago. It's a town of 4,000 people. My brother-in-law is still there as the county attorney. My sister-in-law is a teacher. We have lots of close ties, lots of family and relatives, and lots of trips to western Kansas. So I think that perspective is really helpful, that although I live in the eastern part of the state, there's a very strong connection. And frankly, the issues are somewhat different. I think having a plan that puts incentives in place to help the farm community is critical. And it's so critical in this era where we have the worst drought we've had in 30 years, and already depressed farm prices are adding additional woes to rural families. We need to make sure in most of those communities that there are off-farm jobs, and the state can be a strategic partner in helping small business owners and entrepreneurs who want some technical assistance or economic assistance to get a jump start, the same way we would lure a big business who brings 1,000 employees. Adding jobs in rural Kansas, I think, is critical. Having good schools in every community in the state may be as central to making sure western Kansas doesn't wither away as anything else, as is affordable health care. I talk to people every day who talk about, if we lose our doctor, if we lose our hospital, the town will close, because people will not live or stay in an area where they don't have access to health care services. Everything from broadband technology, which connects rural physicians and healthcare providers with more urban centers for consultation and information, and frankly, lower cost health care. One of the reasons that I blocked the takeover of Kansas Blue Cross Blue Shield by an out-of-state shareholder-owned company was we looked at information that would have suggested we would have added about $300 million to the already rising cost of health care. You can't sustain a system like that. And in lots of western Kansas, Blue Cross is the only provider. It's the only insurer of record. So having access to a Kansas-owned, Kansas-based company committed to providing service across this state, I think is critical to the survival of western Kansas.
I have a two-part question. There are many different styles of leadership. Is there a political leader you admire the most, and what is your style of leadership? And also, what did your father teach you, if anything, about being a governor?
Well, I think my father is certainly one of the leaders I have admired. He learned at a very early age that giving back to the community, providing some kind of public service, was an important way to make a contribution, and that's something he certainly taught me. My father-in-law, Keith Sebelius, had a whole set of wonderful characteristics that my father would have killed for. Keith could walk into a room and knew everybody's name and could identify where he met you and what your children's names were. That's a remarkable talent that Bob Docking and Joan Finney and Keith and very few other people have, but it really makes people feel connected to their government. The other thing Keith was terrific about is he understood from a very early stage in his political career how important the farm community was in western Kansas, not only to Kansas, but to the country, and spent a lot of his years in Washington educating people about how farmers play this critical role in not only our own economy, but really in national security. Having a safe and secure food supply is as much of a national security issue as really border patrols. So they taught me a lot. Certainly watching my dad as governor and having the opportunity to observe, focus on mental health and on education issues and on environmental issues, which were work that he did in Ohio at a time where there wasn't a lot of activity and leadership in those areas, really changed the face of Ohio, I think for the better and for a long time to come. And it was a good example of how a leadership role and a governor can identify priorities, work on them, bring people together to move a state ahead, and that's a great example to follow.
We have a little over 2 minutes. The governorship affords the possibility of a bully pulpit for a leader to speak out about things that may not have any legislative correlates. It just may be something the leader wants to talk about. Would you use the bully pulpit? Would you be an activist governor in that sort of sense?
Well, I think anybody who's ever watched me operate understands that it isn't the big bucks and the fame that draws me to public service. It's really an opportunity to get something done. And I think the governor has not only an enormous opportunity, but a responsibility to use the avenues of talking to people in their backyards, working with legislators, working with business leaders to help shape a focus for the state, help bring a coalition together to work on those priorities and to get some things done. And I would certainly use the avenues available. Again, as insurance commissioner, I used to tell my office, it's hard to be a consumer protection agency if consumers don't know you exist. So we have spent a lot of time over the last 8 years with toll-free hotlines and talk shows and publications to let Kansans know there's a service available, and I think the same thing goes for being a governor.
An accessible governor's office.
Accessible governor. Would you, if somebody said, well, it's not really the governor's role to talk about that, and you said, well, that's right or wrong, I'm going to talk about that. That's the kind of governor you see yourself as?
I don't think there are limitations in what is allowed and what's not allowed. I mean, I would come to the table with, as a mother, as a wife, as a daughter, as a working woman, and as a governor.
Well, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for joining us for this, the second in a series of programs dedicated to the notion that an informed electorate makes wise choices. We sincerely hope you'll be making your wise choice on November 5th. Goodbye.